Hello, my name is Rodan Fizzanelli, and I am talking to you from Lancaster. I am based at the School of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Leeds, and I have had the opportunity to meet John and interact with him on several occasions. Between 2007 and 2009, I have been visiting staff at Seymour, and I have organized an event on migration at the time, together with Javier Caletrio, whom I believe is still based at Seymour today. So I'm going to divide this kind of collection of memories into two parts. In fact, some of them are memories and some are reflections on who John might have been as an academic, and also impressions as to who he was as a person. They say that you like and borrow from the best, and I think John was one of them. I did work a lot with John's work, John's research, because it has been inspiring. And it enabled me to then find my own voice, develop also my own research. And he has been a sort of a distant mentor in more recent years because of his publications. One of the many mentors I like to have. Now, looking back, I was a PhD student when I met him. It was back in 2001. And I was doing my doctorate in history at Lancaster. And I was struggling with some ideas that I had encountered for the first time. Well, as an anthropology undergraduate, I knew of Foucault, but I really didn't know much of his work. And I decided to engage with it in my PhD. So I was looking at the emergence of academia, academic institutions in the 19th century, and I became interested in the production of knowledge, informal, institutional, and informal settings in travel diaries in the press at the time. So thinking about the other, as it were, and Foucault has been very useful in this respect. At the time I visited John because I wanted to know more about how he was thinking about Foucault, because I had read the Tourist Gaze, the first edition. While we were discussing about the writing of history, as it were, I remember him saying that actually we never write things as they are or as they were. We always read from our present. At the time, of course, John was influenced by some post-structuralist discourse, but he was never Foucauldian to my understanding. And then a bit later, as a young postdoctoral student, when I started working on the so-called film-induced tourism, I read some more of his work, especially the one he did, the book he did with Lash and Scott Lash, on cultural industries and the economies, the new economies of science and space. And I used it to develop my own thesis at the time on the ways convergences between cinema and tourism produce what I call the sign industry. And I continued to engage with John's work as a full-time academic, especially when I started interrogating, for example, the specificity of regional, the regional origins of global mobilities, with particular reference to art, technology, social movements, terrorism, and even migration. Quite a lot of what I did at the time was influenced by an understanding of mobilities as systems of multiple and interconnected movements, which is the kind of idea that John would propagate later in his book, 2007 book, I think, Mobilities. There was an interesting divergence in views when it came to what I was trying to do. I remember in 2013, I invited him to endorse my book, Heritage in the Digital Era, and the endorsement that he provided focused on my innovation in the politics of mobility area. And I was really surprised because I thought I was doing culture work. And I never quite understood what he meant. And he never explained. But I can see how politics interacts with culture in what I'm doing. So as always, he was sharp in what he was saying. I think his understanding of my work was as a broader kind of politics of culture and the politics of the polis, of the city, of the urban enclaves, and what is going on in them in the context of everyday struggles, but also in popular cultural contexts and in creative cultural industrial spaces. I can say that my own project still focuses on what I call the mythopoetics of the visual to some extent, but I have already moved on to interrogate also the fallacies of using the visual and visual culture in producing an all-embracing kind of global culture. So I am interested, in effect, in what is going on, what happens to culture and cultural specificity in global capitalist environments. And in fact, even though I started my interrogation into tourism with John's work on the tourist gaze, in more recent years, I launched more or less an attack on the domination of the visual in contemporary cultures as a kind of monologue that begins with European, originally Western and European practices of vision and action, and turns into the only available cosmology to us, to everybody. So what happens to regional understandings and connections with the world? So my more recent work focuses on what I call synesthesia and performative kinaesthetics. Of course, there have been other influences in what I'm currently doing, not less because I have many very interesting colleagues now at Lindsay who are doing very interesting work across different research centers, and I also borrow from them and I learn. Generally, I can say that my politics spans at the moment both popular and high discursive, the elite discursive registers and representations. So I have been influenced by John's early work on tourism and consumption of places, as well as his more recent turn to environmental politics and human, non-human mobilities. And do have a look at my more recent monographs in particular, and you will see that they range from an interrogation and analysis of cultural, industrial, and capitalist settings in different parts of the world to the analysis, investigation into particular cosmologies which are regionally situated. So I've done work now on as diverse countries and cultures as those of New Zealand, Australia, France, Italy, Greece, of course, since I come from Greece. The UK I focused on, especially in the context of the Olympic Games, to think about London 2012. I focused on London, the mega city, the world city, and the world city project has been part of my more recent kind of interest, as was John's. And of course, the New World as well, Brazil, the Old World, the northern part of America, but also South American countries such as Brazil and Cuba. And of course, South Africa and Nigeria more recently, in my latest book, which explores the politics of utopian thinking and how this clashes, especially in cinematic renditions of the future, with real and realist policy planning. So I'm thinking about what constitutes risk in a contemporary socio-cultural and political contexts, such as those of some African countries, but also the UK and France. And of course, the mobility, modernity, and the slum focuses again on the city and environmental politics, but also the digital cultures of tourism and how these articulate particular visions of modernity locally, regionally situated in the city. Now I would like to say a few things about what made John Urry, in my opinion, a great scholar and a nice person as well, a decent person. One of the things I always admired about him was his ability to clarify complex ideas in writing. Something I'm not particularly good at, so I guess I envied him always for that. And he did manage this even for the most confusing themes, such as those of systems theory and complexity theory. His published work has been generally accessible even to upper-level undergraduate students, I would say, and there are some books that today I recommend to my third year, final year dissertation students. Another thing that made John great was his ability to listen. He was very good at listening and listening deeply to what the other people would say. At more personal, interpersonal level, but also academically. He was very good at cherry picking from his discussions with others. And all you need to do these days is to open one of his books and see the array of names that are mentioned there in the acknowledgements. His Lancaster contemporary and older colleagues are mentioned frequently. But there are also more distant connections who are mentioned in his work. And of course, you cannot always mention everybody. But he was very good at adapting things in very creative ways. Another thing he was very good at was his ability to identify up-and-coming socio-political calls and trends. He was a trendsetter as well as a trend identifier. And the good thing about it was that, you can spin lots of policy out of all these ideas, but he was good at then turning them back into intellectual knowledge in the current global context and the attack on academic freedom. And the ways higher education institutions are invited to operate as businesses, I think this is a really tough call, and he was very good at doing this. And of course, outcome was the Center for Mobilities Research. At the beginning of the 21st century, the very new mobilities paradigm which he initiated and then other colleagues developed and are still developing in other ways is another thing he will always be remembered for, I think. And of course, the Institute for Social Futures, which was his last kind of project. And luckily, Lancaster has some equally innovative and creative academics there to carry on with this kind of work. Another thing that I always thought was really good and admirable was his inclination to cross-disciplinary boundaries. Perhaps coming myself from a very interdisciplinary environment in Greece and having this inclination, that was something that I admired most. And still without betraying his sociological devotions, even though he moved on to write books such as Sociology Beyond Societies, was kind of renounced to a great extent the sociological tradition. I think he would return to the voices of Marx and Simmel to the end. So read Offshoring, for example, and Simmel is already there. Or read The Politics of Climate Change, and Marx appears here and there. And still, you can see that from what I'm saying, that, and I always thought that this is the case, that he has been a more or less left-leaning academic, but he did have the ability to talk politically without falling into this petty politics of the left or the right, and that's a skill, I think. In terms of his contribution to the social sciences, one should probably consider two things. His interlocutors and his not necessarily co-creators, well, yes, the co-creators, but also those who were contemporaneous as well. And perhaps it's me reading into someone else's work, things that I only see, but for example, I do identify some similarities between what John was writing more recently on climate change, for example, as a sociological kind of datum, and Margaret Archer's morphogenesis, the morphogenetic approach. I think they also shared, even though they never came together academically, intellectually, they shared some points on the systems theory and the approach. Well, there were others who collaborated with him directly, such as Scott Lash, and what work John moved on to do on consumption, for example, and tourist industries has some elements, I think, some influences also from Scott Lash's work, but also Mike Featherstone's approach to consumption. Then there are some obvious ones, more obvious ones, such as influences from Zygmunt Bauman's project on liquid modernity and globalization, Anthony Giddens's and Ulrich Beck's work on reflexive modernization, Beck's Rich Society, Ronald Robertson's focus on the local and localization. Then some other colleagues, former colleagues, Alan Ward, I think, equipped John with knowledge on class and the notion of habitus to some extent. And of course, his lifetime partner, Sylvia Wolby, whose work focuses specifically on gender, I think appears at certain points in the books that I have read. So this interest in inequalities, which is like an overlay. I don't want to use the term ideological, but a conceptual frame, an overlay in some of the work, especially the more recent one that John did. Howard Lofgren and Marc Auge, and of course Henri Lefebvre's work on space, culture, and the everyday also appear and would in John's writing. He tended to borrow and adapt from a variety of disciplines, different disciplines. More specifically, geography was one of his favorite ones. And of course, there's been a long-term engagement with especially the analysis of non-representational theory as it was developed, for example, by Nigel Thrift. Anthropology, Auge is an interesting example. His last paper on airports, which was co-authored with other colleagues from Australia, from Australian academic institutions, draws upon non-place theory. Philosophy, also politics, media, because John has had a long-standing interest in digital cultures. As consumer cultures, but also as communicative complexes. And of course, these were some of the influences in his work, but he did influence widely as well. Some of the fields I list here, and these are only some, of course: tourism and consumption studies, urban studies, especially the transport and architectural studies, a bit migration studies more recently. Capitalism and global sociocultural transformations have been, I think, at the core, one of the core themes in John's work throughout. And technology-enabled forms of mobility. In many respects, John Urry has been the product of his age, and also someone really able to follow change. His work, for example, on mobile phones is not necessarily something that has been well developed in sociological context. So he would borrow from other disciplines and bring it into the sociological fields. Do I have any regrets or things I would have liked to do and did not? Yes. And I decided to list some of them here just to remind myself of things that will never be done, I guess, and I should not really repeat hesitation, I guess, in my interactions with scholars whom I admire. One of the things that I never managed to do was to ask John for photographic mementos. In fact, a couple of years, no, more than a couple, 3 or 4 years ago, I suggested that perhaps we do an interview. I interviewed him and video record the interview. And he was very hesitant. Then I realized that he doesn't actually like to sit in front of cameras. He said so, in fact. I find this ironic now because he was the tourist gaze maverick, but in that context, I was the one who was acting as the gaze, the technological gaze. I would have liked to ask him about the experience of mentorship. He did mentor a lot, not just of students, but also colleagues, and some of whom actually are now well-known scholars. Mimi Scheller, for example, at Drexel is one of them. And also ask him about the significance of doctoral supervision in his career. And the latter I am very curious about because one of the things I notice always when I would talk, especially to his former students, was that, okay, they would talk about the intellectual influence that he exerted on them, but they would always begin by talking about his gentleness and his kindness. And I think this is a skill that not many academics possess. And I guess my curiosity speaks to experience, and one of the things that he managed to do with me specifically was to be very patient, and I was always very stringy and stressed in our exchanges, and he was very good to manage this tension. Well, I guess it won't happen now, but I am glad to have met him, and I am glad to have accumulated so much with information and then knowledge also from his work. I hope we will have a lovely conference. Thank you very much for listening to me. Bye.